everyone, and welcome to another STP community webinar. Today we are joined by Paul Merrill, the CEO and Principal Consultant at Beaufort Fairmont. He will be talking about the ROI for test automation. Are you missing it? And just a few reminders before we get started. Be sure to register for STPCon Spring 2020 in San Diego by February 14th to take advantage of the early bird pricing. You can see more speakers like Paul and attend a wide range of topics over 4 days of testing content. If you have a team of 3 or more, or if you've attended STP before, you can save even more. Just email us at info@softwaretestpro.com. Paul will be one of our keynote speakers in San Diego, and we are surely looking forward to it. Find more information at stpcon.com. Think you have the next good topic for a webinar, or just looking to get some practice as a new speaker? Go ahead and submit today, as we are looking to fill the second half of the 2020 webinar schedule. You can submit your webinar to STP at softwaretestpro.com. Another quick reminder, our next community webinar will be February 12th at noon Eastern. We'll be joined by Jennifer Boney, and she will discuss the state of artificial intelligence for testing. If you're talking about us on social media, go ahead and tag us at softwaretestpro and use the hashtag STPwebinar. While you're at it, go ahead and give Paul a follow. His handle is @Paul_Merrill. All right, Paul, before we get started, just let me give you a quick introduction. Paul is CEO and Principal Software Engineer in Test of Beaufort Fairmont Test Automation Services. He's a frequent writer on testing and test automation in top-notch testing publications, and he's an international speaker at testing conferences. Paul works with clients every day to accelerate testing, mitigate risks, and increase the value of testing processes with test automation. An entrepreneur, tester, and software engineer, Paul has a unique perspective on launching and maintaining on quality products. You can learn more about test automation at beaufortfairmont.com/webinars. All right, Paul, without further ado, let me go ahead and give you some presentation control.
Thanks, James. It's nice to be here, and I appreciate you all having me. Appreciate everyone being here, and hopefully you can see my screen.
Yep, you're all set. Thanks, Paul.
Great. Well, thank you. So I know James doesn't usually do these things. A lot of times it's SMITA, and I appreciate James doing it today. It sounds like SMITA had a conflict. So thanks so much, James, and thanks for such a nice introduction. So I love STPCon. If you guys don't know it, STPCon is a wonderful conference. I don't get any real benefit out of promoting them except for the opportunity to do some of these types of things and help promote more. But I love STPCon. They do a wonderful job of putting people in position to learn about testing. And I have learned a ton at their conferences. They have wonderful speakers, and San Diego is going to be awesome. I've never been there, and I can't wait to be there. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody out there. My company, Beaufort Fairmont, focuses on test automation. We eat, sleep, live, and breathe test automation. We help folks do 2 things. One is automate regression testing, and the second thing is to sync up dev and testing in agile environments. So if you need training, consulting, or dedicated experts for test automation, give me a call. You see my Twitter handle here, @Paul Merrill. James already mentioned that. Make sure to follow me on Twitter. I love discussing tests, test automation, and all of that on Twitter. And any of the comments here, tag me in if you have comments or screenshots or anything, and I'd be happy to jump into that conversation when I have a moment. So as we get going here, I've got a QR code for you. I'm going to be referencing our simple ROI calculator. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and it helps calculate ROI for test automation. So if you want to follow along, if you want to put your own numbers in and see what your own ROI might be, or if you want to challenge my numbers and look at the math that I'm doing for ROI, this is your chance. So the URL there is bftft.com/ROI-calc, C-A-L-C. The link is there. You can use the QR code in order to get there more quickly on your phone. It's going to be easier to see on a laptop or on a screen. So make sure to take a minute and download that. And I'll leave this here for just another minute. I think a lot of times as technical people in testing, in software development, it's easy to think of the code, and sometimes it's very secondary to think of the business. And the business is what supports us. I think it's easy to believe that we as technical people support the business and make the business happen because of the work we do, which is special and important. But the business running generally supports our activities. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's also easy for us as technical people to ignore things like return on investment And even as we move into leadership within companies as managers, first line, second line managers, directors, VPs, whatever, within technical areas, it's easy to ignore the financial side of this. But with every decision we make as leaders and as individual contributors, we're either helping with the bottom line or hurting the bottom line. Different companies, different organizations have different reasons for existing. Some are revenue-based, some are venture-based, some are public, where they're funded by taxpayer money. So I certainly understand that there are different needs for different companies. But I think in general, looking at financials for private or revenue-based types companies can be helpful in how we work for them. So we're going to talk a little bit about return on investment, or ROI. So let's get started. So the first idea here, and I'm not going to stay all the time in finance, we're going to get back into test automation, and we're going to connect these very, very clearly in terms of return on investment. So return on investment has a simple formula. You take the gain from investment, you subtract the cost from investment, you divide that amount by the cost from investment. It can be expressed as a percentage or as a multiple. Either one works fine. If your cost for investment is higher than the difference between the gain and the cost, you have a percentage less than 100%, meaning you have not paid off the investment yet. If, on the other hand, your gain is high enough and your cost is low enough, that number on the top becomes bigger than the cost for investment, and you've paid off and returned more than your investment was worth. Pretty simple. So what we're looking for on return on investment is a number greater than 100. That means we paid for the investment and we got more out of it. Your stakeholders, your shareholders, your owners, they're not looking to save money. If they wanted to save money, they'd put money in treasury bonds and make 2-3%, whatever the going rate is on that. They're not interested in saving money. They're interested in making money. And in fact, they want to make a lot more than 2%, because 2% would be a very conservative investment. Instead, they want to make more than the markets. So if you're looking at 8, 10, 12%, they want to beat that. So when you're looking at these numbers, we got to think very aggressively, probably more aggressively than most of us are comfortable with. So return on investment, we're looking for a number greater than 100% in a shorter period of time. When we look at the word investment here, if we're using numbers that are annualized, then the entire ROI calculation comes out to be annualized. In other words, are we going to return things within 1 year? So if I use, for instance, annual salaries, an annual amount of investment, an annual amount of gain, then I'm going to come out with whether or not I return my money in the first year of that investment and cost. Make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. So let's do what any good tester would do and be skeptical. Let's look into the terms and make sure that we define terms properly. So you're probably thinking, well, what is the gain and what is the investment? If you haven't been thinking about that, take a moment and think about it as I'm talking this through with you. Write down what you think the gain is. How do we measure that gain? What is it measured in? We're trying to get to dollars. How do we get to dollars? Where are those dollars coming from? And what's the investment? How do we get that number out? I bet a bunch of people are thinking about it in these terms. In fact, most of the clients that I work with think only in these terms. And what I'd like to do is kind of stand the common assumptions about test automation, the investment in it, and the return on it today. And I want to do it in the most simple way we can, which is why I've had you download the simple ROI calculator. Remember, simple. And we're going to get back to that in just a minute. Most people think execution time is the gain, and I totally understand that. It makes perfect sense on the surface. Execution time. How long does it take a human being to do a certain set of tasks related to a test? Compare that to the amount of time that it takes a computer to do those same tasks. The difference is your gain, right? Chances are, in most cases, the execution of the computer will be faster than the human. If you relate that back to dollars per hour, if you take a salary and you look at what the equivalent dollars per hour would be, you can determine pretty quickly what that gain is in terms of dollars. This is, I think, where most people come from and where most people start on the subject of ROI with test automation. My experience over the last 20 years and working with dozens and dozens of companies over the last 4 is that this is a very simplistic, very superficial understanding of this. I want us all to go deeper and have a richer understanding of this so that when we're talking to our peers, when we're talking to our management, when we're working with people, we understand the argument for test automation or against it more clearly, and we can make our cases more sound. Here's what I think actually happens with the gain. Some of the major factors. Execution time is just one of them. And in fact, faster execution is less than or equal to the gain. I keep saying there's more to it. I believe faster execution is less than or equal to the gain. Faster delivery is a major piece of this. If we have test automation working well, if we have continuous integration, we may be able to do continuous delivery. If we can do continuous delivery and deliver our software out to the marketplace faster and more often, we gain a number of things. One of those is less downtime. Why? Because we can recover faster. Jez Humble, Gene Kim, all of these folks talk about this in a number of books related to DevOps. The concept's not new. We've been doing it for many years. DevOps wraps it up into a nice package. Make sure to look at the Phoenix Project and Accelerate and even the Unicorn Project are some of the best ones out there for books to read on DevOps and to get more into this concept. Faster delivery. So if we can deliver faster, that means that when we have a problem in production, we can deliver code to fix that problem more quickly. The only way that we can deliver faster is by being able to make sure that we didn't break things. The way to get faster is not necessarily to add more people, but to find ways to assist the people who are doing this already. Automation does that. Automation assists testers. I've got a cool sticker for that. If you want one of those, give me a yell and I'm happy to send you one. Faster delivery is helpful. It also helps us respond to changing market conditions. We have more demand from our consumers, from our customers than we've ever had before. More demand in terms of what customers expect, how they expect to be treated, and they expect to be treated in a customized way. They expect for problems to be recovered fast, and we as a digital entity of businesses as a digital entity these days must be able to respond quickly to those things. It also can help us outpace our competitors. The companies who have adopted digital transitions and been able to deliver faster outpace their competitors. Those who don't are behind. This is a place where we help companies catch up. The investment. The investment's another piece where I think it's easy to overlook all of the investment that it takes for test automation. I know some of you are practitioners and have done this before and you're shaking your head. Absolutely. I've had managers, many managers. We've had many folks that we work with and partners and customers who before working with us did not understand the investment. They come to us with an idea that the investment is going to be low. The investment many times for good test automation that is reliable, that is robust, that is distributed among the team, that's easily worked with, the investment is higher than it would be otherwise. And that's the automation that we're talking about today, the automation that works. The creation of automated tests is the investment. That's what people tend to think. They think the amount of time that it takes to develop an automated test case equals the investment in test automation. That is not the case in practice. In practice, what we see is that the creation of those test cases is less than or equal to the investment. What actually has to happen many times is that we have to migrate toward towards skills that are more helpful with test automation, not better skills, but skills that are helpful for test automation. We have to migrate toward better tests. This is usually the case. Better is a subjective word, but it's so easy as a manual tester or as a hands-on tester to look at a test case, to know instinctively the type of data one needs to run that test case, to go grab it quickly from a task that they've done a million times SQL query that they happen to have copied and pasted over into a notepad with the credentials for the database that they happen to have in their password buffer. It's so easy to overlook all of those things before we write test automation. We have to write better tests in the sense that all of that has to be considered. A human being can very easily look at a set of data and say, yeah, that won't work for this test case. Or they may be very easily able to do that in some cases. Yeah, that test data won't work to expose the issue to expose with this test case. Test automation can't do that. A computer cannot do that at all. We have to program it to do that, which means we have to have very strong programming skills in order to write very strong test automation. So we usually have to change skills, which requires time. It requires an investment in terms of making sure that the team gets those skills in order to do this. And many times we have to invest in resources. And those resources may be infrastructure. It may be the ability to deploy your product. Test automation is almost worthless without the ability to automatically deploy your application. Resources such as finding people that know how to use the tools you've selected. Resources in terms of money and budget for cloud services. The ability to build out your technical infrastructure as well as your organizational infrastructure. So the investment is more than just the creation of test cases and the time it takes to do that. Before we get into this spreadsheet and this simple calculator, I want to talk about two different projects. These are case studies that we've done and two that I like to talk about. Project A was a disaster. You can look at the chart and see that it was a disaster. The red line here indicates the cost of investment. The green line, which you can barely see down by the x-axis, is the gain from investment. And I've listed this in months. So month 1, month 2, month 3. If you're a software engineer, forgive me for not being zero-based, but all the way up to month. You see in Project B, the scale changes and these months are much closer together. So really, here's 10 months where my pointer is here. I'm hoping you can see that. And we're actually going all the way through 22 months here. The reason that there's only 10 months here is that the project was stopped after this amount of time. When they saw no return, they weren't going through this. This was before I started Beaufort Fairmont. And it was a project that I worked on with a company where there were some major poor assumptions about the way that test automation could work. Maybe poor is the wrong word, elementary assumptions, ones like the ones we've been talking about. They made assumptions that the cost for the investment was just as small as writing the test cases, and that the only test cases we would write would be ones that humans had already done, and we would copy them one for one. They made assumptions about the people that they hired and how they could work on this, and they made a lot of other assumptions. And my ability and the skills that I had at the time were not able to turn this around. There were a lot of other factors going on as well. Luckily, the loss was contained, right? $250,000 is a lot of money, don't get me wrong. But in terms of this particular business, this was a small project and the losses were contained. They needed a different strategy. I can tell you all about the challenges here anytime. There's a case study out on the website you can find in our case study section underneath, I believe it's the About button on the Beaufort Fairmont website, and download the case study. It has both of these in it. It's from a while back. Project B was a lot different. Project B, we had leadership who had experienced test automation before, leadership who had led software development efforts before and projects before. They had the skills to do that. We had a team where the test automation engineers had software development experience before. We had testers who helped build out the automation because we had tools that would allow them to do that without learning to code. And then we had people set up whose only job it was to enable the people who didn't code to do the things they needed to do. In other words, these were test automation engineers who were creating the framework, the support, the structure they needed in order to do the testing. We used a tool called Robot Framework with this, which is one of my go-to tools. I love using it with companies because it's human readable, human writable. You don't have to know how to code to use it. So testers can jump in much more quickly and build out the project. We also were very, very strict in how we approach this. And this is one after I had started Beaufort Fairmont, and they took our advice in how to do this. It worked very well. And you see over a period of 22 months, they got up to a $6 million return, total gain rather. And when you subtract that from approximately, I don't know what that is, $600,000 investment over 22 months, which was across the board for the whole team, that's a pretty big gain. That's little over $5 million gain. So I know some of you are looking at that and saying, there's no way. It's fine, I understand. Let's go through the numbers. We're gonna pull open that spreadsheet in just a minute, and I wanna talk to you a little bit about what it says. This is the way that I calculated this information for a sample company, okay? So we talked about ROI is gain from investment minus cost from investment over the cost of investment. There is that formula there. We've got it figured out here with the numbers in the spreadsheet. There were several assumptions, and I'm listing here to the side. For any of you that haven't pulled down the spreadsheet, I'm going to bring it up. You'll be able to see it through me. But the assumptions were that we had 1,000 tests that were going to be automated, 4 releases per year of the software. So this is very standard, especially within the industry of banking and industries that are more highly regulated. It's still very common to release only 4 times a year, if not less. So 1,000 test cases, 4 release per year, and generally it took 5 days per release to do the testing. So manual testing, that cycle took 5 days to do. They had 10 testers doing that work during those 5 days. And then when they went to automate, they had 2 automation engineers. And we found the time to be, and this is a little aggressive, but I'm using the number of 2 hours per test case to create an automated test. I have a feeling those of you who actually do test automation, if you're honest with yourselves, the average amount of time to create a test is much, much more than 2 hours per test case. If you're a manager, if you're a leader, sometime mark on your calendar when someone started creating a test case and when they ended, and go back and find those times, because it's generally much, much higher than that. So in this case, we found the ROI to be minus 60%. So it's not just that we didn't return the investment, we lost money. We spent money we didn't have to do this. The return came in year 3. Year 3, 3 years later, if you're not investing any more in test automation after the first year, 3 years to return the investment. That's crazy. That's crazy. Hashtag you are so fired, right? There's no way. You can't do this. If you're an executive and you come back to your leadership or your board with these kinds of numbers, no chance. You need to start looking for another job. This will not work. Not at all. So let's dig into this a little bit more. I'm going to pull up the spreadsheet here, and hopefully you all can see this very nicely. This is about as far as I can zoom in right now. I might be able to zoom in a little bit more. Put some comments in here, and James, you're welcome to interrupt me if people have trouble viewing this, if they mentioned it in the chat or in the questions or whatever else. I try to make this as simple as possible, right? There's a problem that we have in the testing world, not just in testing, but with many technical people in scientific fields. We very much know the ins and outs of any problem. We know all of the criteria for a problem. We understand all the details at a very granular level. And we struggle, even with that amount of information, we struggle in convincing people of things. I hear that repeatedly from testers, from developers. How do I convince my boss to X? Well, the answer is to simplify. Simplify the problem. So what I wanted to do was to simplify this. I know as a business owner and I know as an entrepreneur that I've got so much going on. If a developer or tester tries to give me too much information, I just have to shut down. And it's not because I don't like them. It's not because I can't get the information. If I had nothing else going on, if I was sitting on a beach, mind completely free of anything else, and they came to me with the same information, all the details, maybe I could sit there and listen to it all incorporate it all, and take my mind from the point they want me to, from the point I'm at to the point they want me to be at. But on most days, I'm not able to do that. Most days as a business owner, there's no chance that I can really pull up the cash for the problem that we're talking about in my head, put all the details into it, and do some calculation. I need it simple. And most people need things simple. So this is a simple test automation ROI calculator. It does not factor in everything. It's not supposed to. I want to get your thoughts about it, and I want to start a discussion. And I also want to challenge the assumptions that we made earlier, because I know you guys are going to be really good at that. So we start out with inputs. I've only got a few here. Number of test cases to automate. We start with 1,000. Number of releases per year. Start with 4. Amount of days per manual test cycle. Start with 5. Testers per test cycle. Let's start with 10. When we do automate this, how many people do we want to bring in to do the test automation? Let's start with 2. Hours to develop average automated test. Let's be really aggressive and say it only takes 2 hours to develop each test case. These are the inputs you need for this calculator. If you've downloaded this, you don't need to change anything else in this worksheet. These are the only things you need to change. We've simplified for people to understand. And here is where the number comes to. Here's the ROI. Where am I getting that? So I've got a little bit more information down here for you. So we're going to do 3 cases. The first case we're going to do is the example that I just gave you that came up with a negative 60% return on investment. These values are automatically pulled from the input. So number of test cases, 1,000. I've gone ahead and just created a rate. You could change this one to as well if you think that this rate is wrong. Keep in mind when we're doing hourly rates, there are benefits in play. I'm not saying that any tester gets paid this or doesn't get paid this or gets paid this in your area or anything like that. I have no idea about your market conditions, whatever. But if you just take your annual salary and you divide by 2,000 years, you're not going to get the right number. Add at least 40% on top of that for benefits on the states you're in. Different states have different laws and require different benefits, and different companies have different benefits as well. So just keep in mind, you see that number, you may freak out and say, oh, I'm not getting paid enough. That's not what I'm saying here. You're getting paid enough. Maybe you're not. I don't know. This is just for the sake of argument. So annual releases 4, that was an assumption we made. That comes from above as well. So amount of days per test cycle. So if it's manual, we're going to do a comparison here between manual and automated. Okay, so on line 37, manual. We put in all of our information and we come out with a labor cost for the manual test runs during the course of that year, during one cycle, as $20,000. And since it's 4 releases, the annual cost is $80,000. When we run the automated test, so just assuming those original assumptions that the gain is only related to the execution time and the investment is only related to the time to create a test, automated tests, we come out with annual labor cost. So what it costs us to create that is $200. So that puts us at these numbers, and these are the ones that you saw before. So where are the costs? These are the gains. So the gain is 79.8, right? That's a big number. That sounds like a big number, but that's the cost. I'm sorry, that's the return, and it sounds like a big return. Let's look at the cost. So the cost, automation engineers cost a little bit more. You can change that to whatever you think is right. Sometimes they cost more, sometimes they don't, but a lot of times they are. Time to develop test cases, 2 hours per test case. I still think that's very, very aggressive. I think this number needs to be much, much higher. It needs to be like 8 or more. The number of people who can create one automated test case per day, I've found to be pretty low in a lot of cases. So number of test cases, 1,000. So the labor needed to automate those based on these numbers is $200,000. Years to automate is half a year to be automated, and then the time to pay off is 3 years. So that's where that 3 years comes from. So here's the calculation for ROI. We've got 79.8, which is the gain, minus the 200,000 divided by the 200,000 is negative 60%. That's horrible. The cost after that, for every year after that, is zero. We've already done the investment. Once again, we're being simplistic. We're assuming that we never have to invest again in automation. Is that realistic? Not at all. Not at all. But we're being simplistic here to talk through it. In the second year, you're still losing money. In the third year, you're up to 19%. So how else could we look at this? Let's look at this in a slightly different way. What if we include continuous integration? So for those of you who do not know about continuous integration, one piece of continuous integration is the ability to run tests automatically anytime. So a push button run of your automated tests, or run on a timer or something like that. We're going to lock this in with just the releases though. So we're only running that continuous integration with releases. And in fact, the number of test runs per release before was 1 because our manual folks would do it once. So we're going to do it with automation once. After, however, we're going to do that differently. Sorry, so we're going to do this with one release, one test run per release. We had 4 releases per year. So the equivalent test execution labor created. So the amount of time it would take a human being to do this at a dollar amount, $800,000. Annual cost to run, $2,000. The gain, $798,000. You can go and look at the formulas and try to figure it out yourself. Oh, here we go. Sorry. So we had a test run per release before, was only 1. In this case, with continuous integration, we're going to run it 10 times. And 10 times is very small, right? In this case, when we have 5 days per release, and let's just say that we stay at the 5 days of testing, and we run this twice per day, we're at 10 times. If you're doing good test automation, I'm hoping you're running this much more than that, because as a developer, as a tester, I want feedback more often than that. And I also want to put my company in such a place that developers can deliver more often than that to pre-prod environments. So if developers are making change in pre-production and they're making 4 or 5 changes per day, I need to run these tests at least 4 or 5 times per day. And I'd like to do it much more often than that if I can. But we're going to be conservative here and just say 10 times. That's where this number gets so high so quickly, $800,000 on the gain in a year. So if we take the gain, if we take the cost of investment, if we look at the ROI with CI, we're quickly looking at 300% in year 1. Now we're talking, right? Like, what executive are you going to sit down with and say, we just made 300% in the course of a year, and they're going to be like, that's not good enough. They're all going to be really happy with that. You made 3 times my money in 3 years. Can you do that again? Well, absolutely, because in year 2, if we don't do any more investment, we're at 7 times, 700%. And by that year 5, we're just in insane numbers. Now, there are a number of problems with this. I said this is simple. We're using simple math. We're looking at simple formulas. We're making a bunch of assumptions. I want it to be simple for the sake of argument so that we can argue about it. So let's look at both sides of this. These look like great numbers. But Paul, the idea that in year 2, you're not going to invest anything in automation, guess what? Your tests are going to get stale. Your application is going to change. You need to do maintenance. You're going to have to update all kinds of libraries for your automation, all kinds of libraries for your application under test. All that needs to be modified and maintained over time. You're going to find new use cases and bugs that you need to fix. You're going to find out that some test cases didn't have the right set of expectations. So you're going to be constantly working on test automation as time goes on. The idea that the investment is 0 after any period of time with test automation is fundamentally wrong. It does not work that way. You will continue to need to maintain it. Now, what we're hoping is that the automation cost and the benefits from it are much greater. Sorry, the automation cost goes down compared to our hands-on testing, and that the gains get higher and higher. And that's what we typically see in our companies. Usually our clients see so much benefit that they don't spend less on an investment. They spend more because the gain's so high. So they invest more in cloud services to run their pre-production systems, to run their automation against pre-prod. They invest more into automation because they're getting so much out of it. That's what we see there. And the numbers are there to support it. So what if we take this buzzword of continuous testing and throw it into our formula. So let's do that. So before all of this, we had one test run per release. That's what we were doing with 5 days, 10 people. That's the way things were working before. Let's say now that per release, we're going to do 50 times we're going to run our tests. So remember, this was 5 days. So this is only 10 times per day you're running your automation during just those periods of time. Now, continuous testing would suggest that you're actually going to run these much more often than just your traditional release frequency and period of time. Because if you can run your tests more often and more quickly, you shouldn't need that full 10 days. You should need less time, which means that you can release more often. So you're going to do this much more than 50 times. So this is still a very conservative effort, right? Estimate. So if we look at, I'm sorry, that's the cost per run. If we look at test runs per day, let's do one per day, which gives us about 260 working days per year, 260 test runs per year. So excuse me, and I got a little off on remembering what the assumptions were here. And it's much harder to be up here in front of you and remember the numbers than it is to be there where you're sitting. You probably already saw that. So a little grace on your part is helpful to me. I appreciate it, and patience. So test runs per year, 260 test runs per year, running one time per day. That is easily achievable with good test automation. This is highly conservative with good test automation in terms of runs per day. The equivalent test execution labor created. This is the amount that it would cost you to have human beings do this amount of testing, $5.2 million in that year. That's a lot. Now we're talking big numbers, right? So the gain after the cost for the labor to run these is still close to 5.2. And very quickly, we are looking at insane numbers. Numbers so high, nobody even believes you about it. So maybe you don't believe them. Maybe you've got challenges with these numbers. I challenge you to look into the formulas, to look through this, test this spreadsheet out. If you find errors, if you find issues, let me know. Paul@BeaufortFairmont.com or on Twitter, Paul Merrill. Find those, let me know. I always appreciate when it's done in a direct message instead of everybody on Twitter, but I'm okay with that too. If you find them and you want to put them in front of everybody, I'm happy to talk through it and through the assumptions that are there. I think this makes a very solid case. What I'm looking for is for you to look through what you do. How do you do test automation? Go up here into these blue boxes. Put in your numbers. Put in the rate that you think is the average rate per tester, hands-on tester, the average rate per automation engineer, what you believe that is, and see what comes out, see what happens. So a major mobile carrier in the US, one of the biggest ones, used this recently to work through their ROI for test automation. They said the reason was they used it because it was simple. Executives need simple. So it was helpful to them to have a conversation. Do not use this for planning purposes. Do not use this for budgeting. Do not use this for real world. If you want to use it for real world, change it to use your assumptions, change it to a way that makes sense to you. I love having the credit for it at Beaufort Fairmont, but use it as you see fit and make sure that you get something more accurate for you. This is overly simplified in order to have a discussion. It's easier to have a discussion about this. So going back to our slides here, we were laughing at this, right? We were laughing at the minus 60%. We looked at ROI with continuous integration. Tests take 1/10 as long to run, and we run them 10 times more often. But we're still on a release basis, and we're creating labor per release. Then with continuous testing, we're running them every workday, and we're basically creating labor. The gain is the labor we've created. It's artificial labor, so to speak. Here are a few things you need to think about. So as you go through this one activity, I think that is very valuable for teams is to work together, work out that calculator with your own numbers. Another help is to talk about problematic assumptions. We've talked a little bit about some of this, but I want to make sure that we talk about it more because this will affect the return you see, the success of your automation projects. Problematic assumptions. Number one, assuming that we're one and done. What does that mean? Well, we think about that in college basketball or whatever it is, that somebody goes and plays for 1 year and then they're done and they go on to the pros. I think the same mentality is there with test automation for lots of people, especially the people paying the bills, or the people in charge of making sure the bills get paid might be another way to say that, the decision makers. Assuming that we will write test automation once and be done with it is not accurate. I have never seen that. I don't believe it exists. If you have seen it in the real world, please let me know. Where automation has been created one time, it worked close to flawlessly. It took less than, I don't know, a very, very small amount of time for maintenance, for changes over time, and did not require anyone's involvement after any period of time. So if you can run your test even a month or 2 months later and they work right without any human intervention, let me know. I would like to see that, because I'm guessing that if that's the case, you're not really doing any real checks, or your automation is flawed in some other way. It's very, very, very rare that I've seen this. In fact, I don't think it's ever happened. So this assumption that we can write test automation, that we can have automation run anytime because we wrote it one time, is flawed. What's the likelihood that, do you know a programmer who's written a program one time and it worked forever? I mean, there are people who've done this. I don't know them, but there are people who've done this, never had a bug because of the program they wrote. I have a webinar over at the Beaufort Fairmont site where we go into, I think it was a demo on the inside out approach. And in that, we go through just a solution where we were writing unit tests for a palindrome solution. So a palindrome is a series of characters that work the same backwards as frontwards. So DAD is one, it's spelled the same frontwards as backwards. Mom is another one. Their radar is one, kayak is one. So they're spelled the same forward as backwards. And in those 3 lines of code for that solution, we found a multitude of problems. It's so rare that any code can be written without a bug. So assuming that we're going to write test automation better than the software that we create, so much so that we never have maintenance, is a flawed assumption. I see companies all the time on this second bullet point. I ask, how much time are you spending on automation? Well, you know, Susan over there, she works on our automation. She's always working on it. Okay, well, Susan, how much time do you get to spend on this? Well, you know, I get, usually I work on it in the afternoons. And I'm like, okay, how many afternoons? Well, you know, we have a meeting on Thursdays and a meeting on Friday. So it's really Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday afternoons. Okay, so when you get back from lunch, you work on that. Well, no, because usually I have to jump into this and that. And on average, I work probably about an hour a day or an hour a week on this. So check in on your investment with that, because writing good test automation for the people writing the code, whether that's your automation engineers, your software engineers, maybe you're trying to do it with your testers, I don't know. Maybe you've got testers who are growing into that role and learning about it. Maybe you're doing a major initiative to train your testers to be able to do that over a long period of time, years, so that they can have the skills to write code effectively for test automation. An investment of 1 hour per week or 1 hour per day doesn't cut it. It doesn't cut it. I thought I wrote good code after graduating from college with a computer science degree. It was actually 2 years later before I started writing decent code. That's 4,000 working hours. I worked all the time on code, close to 4,000 working hours. 4,000 hours before I'm writing decent code. And I'll tell you something else. What I found out 8 years later, 10 years into my career, is that I finally was able to write decent code. I could take a thought out of my head, knock it out pretty quickly, do it without some of the major bugs that I knew could be outstanding or could be problematic within this particular case, and just knock it out in my native language. That's not even in a new language, programming language. That's in my native language. An investment of 1 hour per week to learn to code, to learn to do automation is not even close. And it's not enough for test automation engineers either, the ones who have learned how to program. It's not enough. So these are problematic assumptions. The investment is much larger than what we think it is. This idea of moving non-coders to coders I just talked about, that is a major, major expectation, a lot of pressure to put on people. We had a client we worked with recently where we were going through the planning of the second group of trainees for a particular tool. and for a particular skill set we were ramping them up on. And I was intimately involved in those conversations and in planning out that training and that transition of that team. And as we went through, we were looking at each learning segment within the curriculum and making sure that it made sense for what we wanted to accomplish with that group. Did the learning segment line up with the skill that we wanted the person to have in a particular role? And we found as we were looking through it that there were some skills that would take us much more time to try to train than if we didn't do it at all, and maybe we could avoid it. But some of those were little things. We think of them as little things as if we're software engineers or if we have a strong background in software engineering from a developer's perspective. Things like code control, right? Git. Oh, that's easy. Yeah, it's easy after you spend the 1 year changing your mind from thinking about Subversion over to Git. Or it's easy after you spend using it every single project in college. Or it's easy when you know the reference card you need and what each command means, right? Gets easy in that sense. But it's a major hurdle to get over. We have to do specific training just for that. It's difficult to learn a loop. I had an entire week in college to learn what the control structure of a loop is. An entire week. So to think that one learning segment for an hour and a half during a week-long training to get people up to speed on looping is enough? No, not even close. We have to have a high investment in the number of hours that these people are going to learn. We have to have a high investment in converting these people if that's what we're going to do. The investment is higher. Codeless. How often do we see record and playback or codeless type tools? Most of the time, codeless doesn't work. Careful what you're looking at there. Record and playback was the first version of this. There are many more versions that look like they're codeless today. There are solutions that work where testers don't have to learn to code, as I mentioned earlier, but they have more to do with your ability to set that up and help people create their new role, understand their new role, and have the proper skills in their new role, even without coding. Slow time to develop tests. This happens all the time. We decide we're going to start with the most complicated, most difficult tests. You got somebody new to testing and you're going to give them the hardest thing to do. Is that what you do with devs? No, you wouldn't do that with a developer. Junior entry-level developer comes in the door. Hey, we've got this bug where we're printing a line on a report twice. Here's the loop where we do that. Can you help us figure out what the bug is, right? We don't say, here's all the reporting code, or here's the 5 different systems involved, and here's the data warehouse that it comes from, and the 5 different data sources for that. Here's the ETL that's involved. No, we don't do any of that. But we seem to think we can do it with test automation engineers. We can't. Some helpful tips. Collaborating with our developers. Developers can be so helpful in test automation. Understanding your test data and managing it appropriately is incredibly helpful. Having a strategy for that or an approach for that makes sense. One button execution. We have to get automation running with one button press. Testability. How testable is the code you're testing? How testable is the application? It's much, much, much more difficult to write test automation for an existing long-term project than for a greenfield project. Every time, every single time, it's more difficult. Consider testability. Was the product built with testability in mind? Resources and leadership. I talked a lot about a software development environment. I'm not saying that you have to have software developers or software engineers running your test automation effort. I'm not saying that that's even a good idea. What I am saying is that test automation is a software engineering discipline. The result of creating test automation is not lowered risk. The result of test automation initiatives is test automation. It's code. It's an application in and of itself that you're building. Consider that when you're thinking through how you're setting up your teams and what you're doing with them. We talked a lot about continuous integration and deployment and continuous delivery. Very important, very helpful. And automated deployments are absolutely key. If you can't do that, you're going to have some challenges. Before I wrap up here, I've got a couple of comments that I found on the web, and I love from my post. So when I did this originally, I had a few people comment on LinkedIn and Twitter and other places, and they were so good I wanted to share them with you, and for you also to know, hey, look, I'd love to hear your comments online. Sometimes they get posted within a webinar here, and you become famous, like Steve G here. So companies have had a hard time determining ROI for a given feature, let alone from an automated test. For me, ROI is measured in increasing the speed of delivering new features. Can your org move swiftly, knowing you will catch regressions? Steve also had this to say. He said, I started at a company at which 2 manual testers were basically running a manual smoke test at least once a day. After automating those checks, and checks is another name for validation points or for automated tests, they could then spend that time developing T-shaped skills or doing exploratory testing. It's hard to affix a dollar sign to that, but I know there's value in it. Nicholas had this to say. Are the number of bugs reported thanks to the automated suite a good indication of ROI? And if not, how do we know it's doing anything helpful? I think that's a great question. And I'm going to leave it to you to think through. Jean Ann, a friend of mine on Twitter, says, and in real life, we've met at conferences. She's a great person, always has a very helpful perspective. As long as you define smart automation, meaning that it should be done as value added, but not for the sake of doing automation. I fear companies take the latter perspective. I've seen that a lot, doing automation for automation's sake. I'm totally open to questions now. I'm going to open this back up with Gene, but keep in mind as you're going through this and you're looking at ROI, keep us in mind at Beaufort Fairmont, keep me in mind, and let's talk about your ROI and getting ROI from your test automation. Thank you so much for having me. James, do we have any questions?
Paul, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And we do. We have several questions for you. We'll try to get to as many as we can. All right, first one. Well, that's the basic challenge to convince clients that test automation brings a lot of benefits and hence the ROI. What are the top 3 things you tell clients which do not want to buy your idea?
The top 3 things that I tell clients that don't want to buy my idea?
Yes.
Well, I say, that's perfectly fine. If you don't want to buy my idea, that's fine. You're welcome to do that. Come back to me when you have different experiences or a different perspective, and we'll talk then. I don't have any interest in selling to people who don't want to be sold to. I'm interested in talking with people who have real life test automation challenges, and they're looking for solutions. So the top 3 things, I guess, that I tell people who aren't convinced that test automation could help, or who aren't convinced that our solutions could help. I guess the main things, I'm trying to think through that. I mean, I guess the main things, it's different at every single company. I mean, the reasons that companies are failing or the reasons that companies struggle generally are different. I'm not sure how to answer that. I mean, there are cases where we have clients who come to us that want to work with us, and they're not ready for test automation. They're not there. And we say, okay, come back to us when you're ready. And that's perfectly fine. We'll have the conversation now and let's start building a relationship. Make sure, I guess one of the top things I say is come back to us when you're ready, or come back and talk to us when you have different questions.
Perfect. All right, next question. For the ROI calculator, how do you count test cases? Does a 5-line TC equals a 37-line TC, or a unit TC versus integration TC?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to figure that out for yourself. This is an example. I think that the way that a particular company develops test cases is the way that they develop test cases. What I'm doing here, once again, is trying to simplify. We can even sit here and say a 3-line test case versus a 37-line test cases like we did in that. Well, how do you know that those 3 lines aren't, if it's automation, how do you know that those 3 lines aren't doing 27,000 things behind the scenes, and the 37 lines isn't just doing the same thing 37 times, or maybe just sits there and does nothing? So lines on a test case, I hear what you're saying. You're trying to break down the argument, and I appreciate that. I think looking at averages is helpful. It may not be perfectly accurate, but it is helpful. So I would suggest that you make the definition for yourself. And if you see a major discrepancy between the size of test cases and how long they run, and you think that something is an outlier, or a piece of data is an outlier, make it an outlier. Don't bring it into your equation. That's perfectly fine. The size of the test case doesn't really matter when you start figuring in averages, unless you have data points that are way far away from everything else. So one test case that takes 47 hours to run, and all the rest of them without that average to 30 minutes, right? Hopefully I'm answering that in a way that makes sense there for you guys.
I think so. I think you covered it. All right. Marcelo wants to know how he can access those spreadsheets.
Yeah, so bftft.com/ROI-calc. And I'm going to go back to the QR code and I'm going to put that up on the screen for you here. So the simple
Okay, so
ROI
I
calculator.
did get a comment that the link was broken. I took off the S on HTTP and it seemed to work.
Okay, well, I have it right here. Let me do this on a screen where I'm not showing you what I'm working on at the moment. So here it is, and here is putting in information and click submit. And there it is, download the ROI. Here it comes right here. So it's not broken for me.
Okay, perfect. All right, next question. Don't quite follow why you would calculate ROI for CI based on comparing costs of doing it manually. Would a team elect to fully run the regression suite if it were to be run manually to begin with? If you get that.
Would a team elect to, can you read the last part again, James?
Would a team elect to fully run the regression suite if it were to be run manually to begin with?
I'm not sure I understand. I think what we're looking at is probably a little bit of confusion around just the way that I did the numbers. So I was looking at the most conservative values that I could, okay? I'm not saying that these are practical reasons and that anybody would really do this. What I'm saying is that let's say in the worst case that a team got to the point where they had automated 1,000 of their test cases, and it used to take human beings however long to do it. If we only ran those test cases one time during that period of time, this is what would happen. So it's just simplifying the calculation to make the worst case, because if I make the best case, the numbers are going to be so crazy, nobody's ever going to believe it, right? So we have to have some comparison in order to figure out what the gain is. Would they continue to do the manual tests? No, they wouldn't. But in order to have a number, we have to find it somewhere. And the number is, this is how much it would cost for a human being to do this anyway. So hopefully I'm answering your question with that. Happy to discuss more offline or through Twitter or whatever else.
Right, yeah, reach out to Paul if you need to.
Please.
Another one here. Do you think that the number of bugs detected with testing and cost of a bug in production affect the ROI calculation for test automation? If yes.
Yeah, so these are wonderful questions. That's a really good question. Does the number of bugs detected? Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. In fact, I think one thing that would be really nice I'd like to create is a defect calculator, cost of defect calculator, to figure out how much it actually costs you per defect, how much a defect costs your team as testers, your team as developers, all of those folks. You know, there is a piece of this where we're making an assumption that test automation finds bugs. Test automation doesn't find bugs. Human beings find bugs. Test automation can do two things. Test automation can detect change within a system, right? So if the system changes, it can detect it because the automation presumably stayed the same. So it can detect change, or it can detect correctness, provided we wrote the test correct to begin with. So I think there's a little bit of an assumption built in there. Absolutely. Go back, take these spreadsheets, work on them on your own, add in what you think the cost of a bug is, and if it's different with automation or not, and see how it calculates for you. I think that'd be wonderful, and let me know how it goes.
Great. All right. Let's see if we can get another one in here. What is your opinion on AI automation tools, for example, AI for visual testing?
Yeah, so this is so funny because I had 2 conversations with vendors in the last 48 hours about AI, less than that actually, 30 hours, I guess. So what is my view on those? Visual testing, I think, has its place. I think all these things have its place. I think that testing is an activity that AI is not going to take over anytime soon. I think that testing is an activity that's done by humans. I think that the automation we create, whether it's AI based or not, is a support system for testers. Testers are the ones who are figuring out the Oracle problem. Testers are the ones who are determining whether a requirement was correct, whether it was implemented correctly. The tools that we're using are detecting change, even in those 2 cases. So visual testing, I think, is really, really helpful. I love visual testing like Applitools Eyes and some of the other products that are out there. I love them because it's so easy to write a test. And I don't think test automation is just Selenium, by the way. A lot of people you talk to just assume you're talking about Selenium when you're talking test automation. That's just not even the tip of the iceberg. That's just the tiniest tip of the iceberg. It's so easy to write a test case that works because the internal structure of the web page is correct and Selenium doesn't find a problem. But then you look at it as a human being and you notice something is different. Visual testing can help you find that and close that gap. So it's one more support tool for us. AI can do some of the same kind of stuff with the structure of the page, maybe the visual part of the page or application. But AI is not to the point of being a general intelligence yet. Most people are using machine learning. I think that there's a lot of promise for it. I think there are a lot of good things that it can do. I think that it can absolutely, some of these tools can speed up that codeless part or the development part, how long it takes to develop a test case. But it's not gonna replace human beings in terms of understanding what needs to be done and how it should be done anytime soon.
Great. All right. Do you think you got time for one more?
I'm fine if you're okay.
No problem. Here we go. If we had a balance of manual testers taking advantage of their critical thinking skills, high-risk test cases, versus automation to run the mundane tests, how would you calculate ROI for the manual testers?
Yeah. So I think that goes back to the value of a defect that one of the other folks was asking. Okay, so I needed some reference point in order to do any kind of calculation. I think that it is a reasonable reference point for this calculation with this calculator. I think it's one that many people try to do, and it's where they start. I wanted to put it into some type of thing that I could persist and that you all could play with. If we want to go back and look at the value of a manual tester, the value of a manual of a human being, and I'm not going to say manual tester, but a human being or a tester, is extremely high, especially with a good tester. How do you calculate the return on investment for a manual tester? I haven't really thought through that, but I'm guessing if you would have to have a baseline to start with. So what is our baseline? So let's say that we have no testing whatsoever, and then we add a human being to do testing after that. So we've invested in the payroll, the labor for this human being, and we're expecting that to somehow pay off. Then it's got to pay off in terms of, boy, I'd like to know who asked this question. But I don't know. I guess you'd have to look at what the output is, because there's a real return in terms of labor, artificial labor created with automation. But I don't know what the return is on the human being's efforts. Instead, I think that the argument that Michael Bolton and others have is more correct for human beings doing testers, which is that there is no return there. Instead, it's a cost savings effort. So I'd have to think more about that, but I do think that the outputs are different from test automation versus human testing.
Okay, perfect. And we do have a few more. I'm going to go ahead and just send those to you via email, and you can reach out to them if you'd like.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity, James, and STPCon. I look forward to seeing everybody in San Diego.
Thank you. You too. We can't wait to have you in San Diego. We're looking forward to your keynote.
Me too. Y'all have a good one.
Thanks, Paul. All right, everyone. That ends our webinar for today. Again, if you are on the fence of signing up for STPCon, look no further than Paul. We do have some great speakers coming, including Paul, and be sure to reach out to us at info@softwaretestpro if you have a team or if you need the alumni discount code. All right, our next webinar coming up is going to be the State of AI for Testing. That's with Jennifer Bonine of pinklion.ai. That's going to be Wednesday, February 12th. It's always on noon Eastern. All right, everyone, thank you so much for attending. We appreciate all of your support. We hope to see you all in San Diego. Thank you so much.